Mr. Speaker, no one on our side of the bench is going to claim that people like Kosmynina or Bashar al-Assad were legitimate leaders of their countries in the years in which they repressed them. But we think 100,000 dead people in Syria from a failed attempt to transition to democracy, a failed democracy in Egypt where the Muslim Brotherhood is effectively being outlawed, their leaders have been locked up, and moderates being set aside and have been fractured and pointed towards supporting institutions like the military, points to the fact that we should regret the Arab Spring. So how are we going to set up this debate? Reasonably simply. We think that the Arab Spring has done more harm than good to the people on the ground in a vast variety of countries. So places like Syria, Tunisia, Libya, etc., broadly any country you could define where the Arab Spring, we're happy to debate about here. But there would be benefits to the people had there been dictators for a longer period of time, but quite happy to claim that it would be better for far greater stability in the Middle East. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First, why the lives lost and the creation of sectarian warfare in the Middle East far outweigh any purported gains in democracy that we may have asserted us by the opposition. But secondly, to tell you why there hasn't been a benefit in improving democratic rights in those countries, why it's been far, far worse than you would have had you had a stable dictatorship for a longer period of time. So first, the balance of power. We need to recognise that the Arab Spring spread incredibly quickly across a very diverse set of countries, very diverse sets of issues, across diverse populations who didn't necessarily agree upon what the end result of any transition away from dictatorship should be. We saw repression of certain ethnic groups and repression of democracy at large in the Middle East before the Arab Spring. But why has the transition caused more harm than good? A number of reasons for this. Firstly, we point to instances like Syria where we've seen basically sectarian warfare created in the Middle East. The disturbing of power structures to maintain a level of non-conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims and between groups like Hezbollah and their natural Shia people in parts of Syria has caused massive amounts of harm to the Middle East at large. Before the Arab Spring, you didn't have sectarian conflict being caused in those sorts of countries. You didn't have the kinds of warfare we're openly seeing where Sunni preachers advocate for people to go and fire at Hezbollah strongholds. We see places like Lebanon basically destabilised and the entire fracturing of those countries. Therefore, we think the Arab Spring has caused a massive amount of harm to the ability to have a functioning and stable Middle East. We also point out the fact that it's brought Israel far closer to conflict with all these sorts of countries. We've got Israel bombing chemical weapons transitions or trucks coming from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah. That's a massive risk given the consequences of Israel going to war with Iran or going to war again with Hezbollah, the massive loss of huge amounts of lives, as we saw in 2006, and that's we think a war with Iran with Egypt. Why are those things necessarily part of the Arab Spring? Because as I've said, it's disturbed a very fragile power basis. Other examples here. We talk about places like Bahrain, where the Sunni minority has been supported by Saudi Arabia and massively repressed democratic rights and murdered hundreds of people in the years and years since. Some countries have had much better stability in those sorts of places. We talked about places like Tunisia and to an extent Libya. Libya's civil war, although it ended a democratic transition at the end, still killed many, many people, ladies and gentlemen. Tunisia still has had opposition leaders murdered, those sorts of things. You cannot enjoy democracy and really basic stability and functioning where you don't have a civil war raging around it. So to the extent that we say that democracy may have been instituted, I'll get to in a second, in these countries, it is not worth the cost in lives and blood and destabilisation in the Middle East. Elle.
If spontaneous, widespread and popular protests aren't evidence of a population that is ready for and wanting democracy, what would be?
Elle, we're not going to claim that they didn't want democracy. This debate isn't that the people in the Arab Spring didn't want democracy and we regret the fact that they wanted democracy. That's bizarre. It is that the instances of what's happened has caused massive amounts of harm. That point of information is utterly irrelevant to the entire point of this debate. That's why we'd say the fact that they wanted democracy doesn't prove that we shouldn't regret the Arab Spring at large. Because if they're wanting democracy and the transition has caused far more death and violence you would have had under stable dictatorship, then we should regret the Arab Spring. Had dictatorships, you wouldn't have seen the kinds of sectarian movement because those people had incentives to maintain the natural balance of power in the Middle East. That's why Saudi Arabia formed alliances with Israel. That's why Egypt formed alliances with Israel. You didn't see the kinds of destabilisation across borders in Syria and Lebanon themselves. We're not going to claim that it's great that people's democratic rights have been suppressed. We're going to tell you that it's been far worse than the Arab Spring has happened. That would have happened had there been a longer-term dictatorship. So secondly, democratic reforms. We think it's just not true that there's been a massive advance of democracy in the Middle East for a number of reasons. First, democratic reformers in the Middle East had a hard job to begin with getting kinds of broad public support at large. We point to the fact that in Egypt, the democratic reformers made a particular narrow subset of the population in power predominantly, not necessarily getting along with sorts of people in the Muslim Brotherhood and other religious minorities. That's why you haven't seen the kind of unified opposition to existing power structures that suppress democracy. That's why the military in Egypt has been able to maintain control by playing off democratic reformers against each other. That's why the moderates in Egypt have betrayed democracy by supporting the banning of the Muslim Brotherhood and the removal of Mohammed Morsi from power. But even Morsi himself has been suppressing democracy to a large extent in his term in power. By doing this, they tried to ram through a constitution that massively discredited and gave huge amounts of power to the Muslim Brotherhood. By doing this, they're doing deals with the military when the military still wanted him in power to give them oversight of things like judges and constitutions. I'll take over things if they go to POI. Yes?
So, the great thing about Egypt is when the government goes too far, restricts freedom, and imposes their own power, there's yet another uprising. Just because things sound good right now, why would there be an uprising soon to fix that?
14 million people in Cairo was not the democratic will of the Egyptian people. The massive economic sabotage campaign done by the military to shut down the economy, to pressure Mohammed Morsi is not a genuine democracy at heart. That is perfect evidence of the way in which democracy is being co-opted in places like Egypt. But it's not just Egypt itself. It's places like the you've got no effective central state. You've got basically bans and warbands controlling certain sections of territory across the Middle East. It's crackdowns in places like Saudi Arabia, where even basic reforms were immediately snuffed out because they were afraid of further risk and fire spreading across the Middle East at last. Within there being a massive frustration with the democratic project itself, within the Muslim Brotherhood isn't likely to accept democracy in Egypt in the future because it doesn't believe it's ever going to have a legitimate position that is respected by the military. What would have happened having had dictators for London? Would there have been more time for democratic reformers and influence and different minorities to try and find some agreement on these particular things? None of these people had clear ideas of what they wanted their state to be in the first place. They need to have a clear policy objective and understanding what you want that state to be in the future to take on existing power structures that want to suppress democracy, like the military in places like Egypt. We point to the fact that in Tunisia, opposition leaders get effectively assassinated and pressured out of running in particular elections. We haven't seen the kind of democratic transition we need. That's why the Arab Spring hasn't led to any kind of democratic progress, because you need a proper functioning democracy over the long term. Not just a revolution that displaces one dictatorship and replaces it with the dictatorship of the military, as we've seen in Egypt. Mr. Speaker, a panel, and members of the audience. The Arab Spring was the democratic will of the people in those countries. But it wasn't effective, and it didn't lead to any benefits. It killed 100,000 people, and we regret that.